When we read a story critically, there are a number of things that we need to do. We are analyzing the essential elements. First of all, we have to look at character. We have to determine who participates in the story. Are they major or minor? One way to define them is that a major character is one who seems to control the action, or a character from whose perspective the story is told. So we need to distinguish between major and minor. One distinction is that you learn a lot more about the major characters than you do about the minor characters. Sometimes when we talk about characters, we talk about a protagonist, the character whose affairs seem to move the story along rather than a hero or a heroine, and an antagonist, a character whose affairs or interests seem to contradict those of the protagonist. So when we talk about major characters, we talk about those that we know a lot about. We also talk in terms of a protagonist, the one whose affairs move the story along, and characters who are in conflict with that character. And then minor characters act in relationship to the major characters. Think sort of in terms of a planet and its moons. So one thing that we need to do is to identify character. The second thing we need to do is to be able to say what happened. What is the sequence of events that take place in the story? Can you recount them? Then we need to look at plot. What influences what happens? E.M. Forrester, in the text called Understanding Fiction, makes a distinction between narrative and plot. The narrative is simply what happens next. Forrester says that plot, though, is what happens as a result of something else. One of the examples that he gives is that the queen dies, and then that the king dies, and then the queen dies. That's the sequence of events. The king dies, and then the queen dies of a grief is a plot. There is causality. So when we're looking at plot, we not only want to look at the narrative line, the sequence of events, but we also want to look at the plot. What happens as a result of another action? In a well-constructed story, nothing can be removed without changing the story in its entirety. Everything has an essential part to play. Nothing is wasted. When we look at plot, we can also look at conflict. And the conflict is the challenge that exists, the struggle that needs to be resolved. Sometimes the conflict can be between two individuals. We call that man against man, man versus man. It may be a person against the elements, the setting, the weather. That would be man against the universe. And then we say man against himself. That is, that internal struggle that individuals have. So when we read a story critically, we want to look at who the characters are and the weight of their role, the storyline or narrative line, what happens in what order, the plot, what is the relationship between those ideas, and finally the conflict. What is it that is being resolved through the course of the story? These are the essential elements. Who is involved, what happens, and what conflict is there? Next, we want to look at the structure of the story, the point of view. Who is telling the story? Is there one character who speaks throughout the story and tells the story from his or her own viewpoint? That's a first-person point of view. If we have a first-person point of view, that means we can only know what that character knows, legitimately. And we can also ask whether or not the first person narrator is reliable. We can have a third person narrator, sometimes called an omniscient point of view, which means that there is no single character telling the story, but the story is being told about the characters in the story. In this case, the narrator has access to thoughts and feelings, has access to place and time that one individual would not have. So, what is the point of view? Who's telling the story? The second thing about the structure is how the author uses time. Is it a sequential progression? That is, do we start at the beginning and end at the ending? Or do we start in the middle? Medias res, which is Latin, which means in the middle of things. Do we start in the beginning and then go back in time? Sometimes this is done for effect, but we need to look at how the author uses time. We also need to look at how the author uses setting. Where does it take place? Is it historical? Is it something within the mind of the character? Where is the story happening? And then one other distinction we can look at is perspective. And in this case, it's not the same as point of view. It is whether or not we are looking at the story from a distance or from up close. Does it shift? This text suggests that we think in terms of a camera angle. So what is the structure of the story? Point of view, time sequence, which is complementary to the narrative storyline, the author's use of setting, and the perspective from which the story is told, the camera angle. The third thing we look at are rhetorical elements, the use of irony, imagery, symbolism, and language. Irony can be dramatic, situational, or verbal. Irony is the unexpected, and in some literary circles it is suggested that irony trumps everything. Dramatic irony is the fact that the reader experiences something unexpected without knowing anything beyond what is in the story. That means we get to see what happens that the character doesn't expect. In situational irony, there is the unexpected for both the character and for us as the reader. And then there is verbal irony, when something means more than one thing, and it may reveal special information. So dramatic irony is when we see something unexpected happen to the character. Situational irony is when something unexpected happens to us and the character. And verbal irony is when the language sets up expectations that are fulfilled in unexpected ways. Images may recur. You remember that images appeal to the senses. So we have visual images, auditory images, tactile images. We see, hear, feel, taste, touch. Those things help us understand the world better because we experience through our senses. But if there is something that recurs, that means that we need to pay attention to it. So if we start seeing birds, or if there's particular color, then we should pay attention to that because that repetitive image has some special meaning. Remember, the author only puts things in with purpose. We need to look at symbols. Anything that is symbolic first has a literal meaning, and then that broadens to a symbolic meaning. But we need to look at that in terms of, is there something that can mean more than what it initially appears to? We can go back to those recurring image patterns. It may be that it is pointing to something specific, or it may be that that image pattern becomes symbolic. We need to identify the special use of language, that is, particular word choices, figures of speech like similes and metaphors, all of the things that we look for in any literary text, we look for in a short story, because these things help to support our interpretation. So is there irony? Are there image patterns? Are there symbols? Are there special uses of language that we should pay attention to when we look at rhetorical elements? And finally, we take all of those things together and we interpret. We identify what we think the central or dominant message or claim seems to be. All stories do not have lessons, they do not teach morals, but there may be something that is presented in such a way that we carry that value out of the story. We may see the theme in the patterns of images, in the symbols, in the settings, in the characters. Those, any one or all of those, may contribute to the theme, the message being presented. The character and their voice and values, something that we call personas, may help us understand the theme of the story. It may be that the theme is a certain value, and it may be even announced. However, what we want to look for is some idea that we can carry away from the story. We should, once we determine the theme, be able to pick particular text, passages from the story that support that interpretation. We also should be able to identify contextual evidence that points beyond the story in certain ways. While we do not want to look at the story as being autobiographical, we still can take the context of the author's life to help us understand. So if the author lived during World War II and is writing about war, then we understand the context of the story. So we still do not want to attribute the meaning of the story to the author's intention. That is, we should let the text itself stand on its own to create meaning. These are the things that we look for when we read a story to find meaning from it. We identify the essential elements, the characters, the narrative line, the plot, and the conflict. We look at the point of view, the use of time, the use of setting, and the perspective. Close up, far away. We look at rhetorical elements, images, symbols, figures of speech, allusions, irony. And taken together, looking at the story carefully, we find meaning in the story. What does this help us to understand about the world, about ourselves, or about our relationships with others? What does the story say? And can you support that and can you support that interpretation with text? Can you use examples from the story to support the position that you have taken with regard to what the story says?